Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I'm gonna come clean here. I have a bunch of mini PC reviews that I need to do over the next few weeks. To start out, MinisForum, one of my favorite companies that makes these devices here, they sent me a bunch of them. They've released 3 over the past 3 weeks. But at the same time, I had a bunch of handhelds arrive in the mail too. If you remember, we had the AYN Odin Lite, then the Aya Neo Air Pro, and then finally the Retroid Pocket 3. So I prioritized those reviews over the others, and so now we've got a bunch of mini PCs to knock out. But I actually think this is a pretty good opportunity because we'll be able to compare them side by side. And I found that each of these have their own unique use case. The one we're going to review today is the TH80, and as you can see, this looks a lot like a Mac Mini. As you can see, it even has like that circular bottom to it. And so I think this one is a pretty good match if you're looking for something in like an office kind of scenario. Not only does it look really sleek, but it also does a lot of like everyday tasks really well, including video editing. Now, of course, we're going to focus on gaming and emulation as we do in all my videos. And I will say up front, when it comes to PC gaming, this isn't the best. I found that it actually performs a little bit worse than I was expecting for that price point. But I was surprised to find how well it did when it came to retro game emulation. PS2, GameCube, and even the higher end Nintendo systems all did well above what I was expecting at this price point and with this model. And so today we'll just kind of do my typical mini PC review thing where we'll take a look inside and then we'll also try to put it through its paces. And hopefully by the end of this video you'll have a good idea of whether or not the MinisForum TH80 is the right device for you. Anyway, without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, let's start by talking about price. Now here on the MinisForum webpage, you can see that the device is actually listed under Office Mini PCs. And as we'll see later in the video, I think that's a good place for it because I think it is going to fit pretty nicely in an Office PC scenario. Now there are 2 different models in the TH form factor here. There's the TH60 with an i5-11400H, and the bare bones version of this starts at $359. Of course, if you add RAM and a hard drive, it is going to drive the price up. I would generally recommend getting 16 gigs of RAM here, and as you can see, that brings the price up to $479. Now, if we bump that up to the Core i7, which is the model that I'm testing here, it goes up to $560. And so I'm kind of treating this like a $560 mini PC in my head. You could bump up the RAM to 32 gigs, but I honestly don't think that's going to be necessary. Now, in terms of differences between the TH60 and 80, you can see here that the i7 processor has more cores and threads, and it also has a higher boost clock speed as well. Now, whether or not that's going to be worth the $50 upgraded price, that's really going to be up to you. But if I had to choose between the two, I would probably go with the i7. $50 isn't a huge price for an upgrade, and it's always better to future-proof your devices as much as possible. Now, the i7 is an 11th generation Intel chip, and it came out around this time last year with a recommended retail price of about $400. Okay, let's move on to the unboxing. The box itself is pretty small compared to the size of the PC inside. It does come with a manual with some mounting instructions. And here's a look at the power supply. This is a 90-watt power supply altogether, and it is pretty big. Also inside is an HDMI cable, as well as a VESA mount and some screws. Looking at the PC itself, it is made out of aluminum here on the top. It has a bit of a hollow feeling to it, but it does look pretty nice. And yeah, on the bottom, it is very reminiscent of a Mac Mini. Up front, we have a few ports. As you can see on the left is the USB-C port, which is capable of video out up to 4K 60 Hz. We also have a USB-A 3.2 port, a headphone microphone jack, and then a power indicator. On the back, we have a Kensington lock, the microphone and audio jack, 4 USB 3.2 ports, a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and then also HDMI and DisplayPort, both with 4K 60 Hz, then the power plug, the power button, and then the clear CMOS button. So now let's take a look inside. In order to access the inside, you need to get a screwdriver to pry open this bottom part here, and it's just stuck together with adhesive, so be careful when you're pulling this apart. Once you have it removed, you will expose 4 different Phillips head screws. These are kind of deep in there, so you need to make sure you have a screwdriver that can access them. And then after you have the screws removed, you can pry open the bottom case. So let's take a look at what we have inside. We'll start with the Wi-Fi chip, as you can see here. And this chip is capable of Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.3. And so next, let's take a look at the M.2 SSD. Now, for the most part lately, MinisForum has been using Kingston SSDs, but this one in particular is a Phison one. And I'm not super familiar with this brand, but they have been around for about 20 years now based on some research that I did. Now, one thing you may notice, there is no SATA port here available at all, but there is an additional M.2 if you wanted to add an additional SSD. And there's also a SATA connection right here, so if you have the plugins for it, this might work as well. Now, in terms of accessing the RAM itself is actually underneath the heatsink and the fan. You can kind of see it peeking out here. And this is Kingston RAM here and also is dual channel. But in order to access it, you would need to remove this heatsink. So not really the most easily upgradable PC in the world, but at least the RAM is upgradable. But yeah, that's about it on the inside. Now for comparison, here is an actual M1 Mac Mini. I use this as a media server here at the house. As you can see, the MinisForum is a little bit smaller, about a finger width on each side. But in terms of design, you can definitely tell where MinisForum got some of their inspiration. One of the key differences between the two is that the Mac Mini is about twice the weight of the MinisForum one. It just doesn't quite have that same amount of heft as the Apple product. In terms of sizing compared to an Xbox controller, as you can see here, these are both pretty small PCs. And of course, for a real comparison, let's try some Kerrygold butter. Now, one thing that does add to the bulk of the MinisForum is that AC adapter. Overall, it does give it a bigger package, something that you wouldn't find in something like the Mac Mini. And even compared to other MinisForum mini PCs, this one's pretty big too. It is quite a bit thinner than some of the more chunky MinisForum mini PCs, but overall it just has a lot more surface area. And so here is what it would look like in a typical desk setup. And honestly, I think it looks pretty good. It has a nice, clean, kind of sleek interface to it, and I think it would look really great in a home office environment. In terms of just web browsing and things like that, it is super zippy. I think the 16 gigs of RAM is just perfect on this thing. And so if you're looking for a Windows-based PC that kind of has that Apple or Mac form factor, this might be a pretty good fit. Now let's go ahead and really start this thing up and take a look inside. And yeah, as you can see here, I'm using that i7 processor, 16 gigs of RAM with Windows 11 Pro. Let's do a quick thermal testing. As you can see here at idle, it's about 40 degrees Celsius, and it's set to a 45 watt TDP, but the power draw seems to be between 4 and 5 watts. At least that is while on idle. Now let's go ahead and run Cinebench here and max all of the CPU cores to 100%. And here you can see after about 10 minutes of heavy use, the temperatures are getting up into the mid to high 80s. Now it's still getting nowhere close to 100 degrees Celsius, which would induce the thermal throttling, so you don't have any of those issues to worry about. So yeah, just overall in terms of thermal profile, this seems to do a very good job in keeping it well under 100 degrees Celsius and no thermal throttling. Now if you're curious about the Cinebench scores, you can see here it's just under 8,000 points. Now when it comes to benchmarking, I'm not a huge numbers guy. What I like to do is test real world scenarios. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab one of the videos I just completed the other day, and I'm going to import it into DaVinci Resolve, and I'm just going to cut the living daylights out of it and then just put it all together and make a 1-minute clip. In addition to cutting up and moving around all of the parts to make it hard on the video rendering, I'm also going to add some transitions and graphics as well. And so this should give you a good indication of what the video editing process would be like if you wanted to use this PC. We're going to export it to 1080p 60 frames per second. And I gotta say, the overall video editing process on this was nice and fast. I didn't have any issues altogether with getting any of this stuff to work. When it came to render time, a 1-minute clip took about 58 seconds altogether. Now, my personal benchmark is to make sure render time is less than the runtime of a video, and it barely squeezes in there. And so if you were interested in doing some lightweight and 1080p video editing, I think this might be a pretty good device. Of course, there are other PCs out there that could do this much better, especially those with dedicated graphics cards. But I think for that price point of around $650, that's not terrible. But let's see what else this thing can do. Let's move over to PC gaming. Now, if you've ever watched any of my PC game testing, what I like to do is test everything at 1080p at the highest settings possible, and I start with the easy games and move my way up. Now, to start with the easiest game, what I picked here is Garfield Kart. Now, I'm running this at 1080p, and I did bump up the settings to high settings. And surprisingly, this would dip down to below 60 frames per second here and there. Overall, the gameplay was relatively smooth. I didn't have any issues with it other than when I was looking at the numbers. However, if I moved over to some other 1080p games, for example Hades here at default settings, it could not keep up at 60 frames per second. And I definitely did feel a little bit of chugging here and there. It wasn't a super smooth gameplay experience. And so I thought, okay, let's move over to 720p and see how these perform. And so similar games, something like Ori and the Will of the Wisps at the balanced or medium settings, 60 frames no problem. And so I do think if you want to play some lightweight PC games on this, 720p is probably going to be your best bet. Now 720p works pretty well on some of the other harder to run games. You can see here Grand Theft Auto 5 is getting over 60 frames per second, but that's with 720p and low settings. Similar settings for Halo Reach with 720p and performance settings did give me a solid 60 frames per second as well. This wasn't a bad experience, but not quite as graphically sharp as I would like. And other games would actually get a more stable 30-ish frames per second, and sometimes that can work out pretty well. For example, with Control, I actually found 30 frames to be okay. Now I was getting some screen tearing here, but this actually has to do with my capture card and not actually the PC itself. And so if you have a monitor that's capable of something like FreeSync or similar other syncing options, you should be fine. Now other games ran at around 30 or 40 frames per second like Doom Eternal, and this was not a good gameplay experience. This game in particular really just needs something closer to 60 frames per second to feel good. Even though it rarely dipped below 30 frames per second, the overall gameplay experience was just kind of sluggish. And about the cap that I found here was Rise of the Tomb Raider. I played this at 720p at the very lowest settings I could find, and not only did it not look very good, it struggled to even maintain 20 frames per second. And so I would definitely not recommend this PC for AAA PC gaming from anything over the past like 8 or 10 years. Now, PC gaming is just one slice of the pie. Let's go ahead and move over to emulation and see how it fares there. I'm not really going to cover any of the lightweight stuff. We're just going to move into PSP and above. And for this, I did quadruple the resolution to a 1080p, and as you can see, it's running just fine. In fact, just about everything I threw at it, including God of War, was playing at a 4x resolution with no slowdown whatsoever. So I think if you want upscale PSP, this will work, but I definitely think it's going to be capable of more than that, especially at this price. So let's move on. In terms of GameCube, I did a 3x resolution, which is also 1080p, and as you can see here, it's running great. In fact, GameCube was running surprisingly well compared to the PC games that we were trying just a moment ago. Everything I threw at it played really well at 1080p all the way through F-Zero GX. And I didn't have to do any sort of hacks or configuration or anything. This was basically just plug and play. And so if you're looking for GameCube at a 1080p resolution and maybe even higher for certain games, this is going to work out well. Along those similar lines, I tried out some Nintendo Wii using the Dolphin emulator as well, and I also kept it at a 1080p resolution. Most of the Nintendo Wii games that seem to struggle with emulation, things like Donkey Kong Country Returns, Super Mario Galaxy 2, these were playing just fine. Donkey Kong Country was doing 1080p no problem, but for Mario Galaxy 2 I did bump it down to 720p instead. But honestly, even at 720p, this game looks great. Now, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom did have a little bit of slowdown when you tried to do like those big epic special moves, but I think a lot of that had to do with shaders caching. The more often that you did the moves, the faster the gameplay was. Moving over to PlayStation 2, this one also did really well when it came to 1080p gaming. And again, like with GameCube, this is a 3x resolution. Now, it did just fine with the easier to play games, but I was surprised to find that some of the harder ones did well too. So for example, Grand Theft Auto 3, even when I was crashing around other cars, this usually will cause slowdown, no problem here, 60 frames solid. And same thing with Ratchet & Clank, I didn't have to do any sort of settings changes whatsoever. And so if you want to play some of those 3D platformers that were really good on the PS2, you should be able to play most of these at 1080p without any sort of finagling. Of course, a lot of people are curious about how the God of War games play, because these are always really hard to emulate. The first God of War game mostly stayed at 60 frames per second at a 1080p resolution. Every once in a while, I would get a little hint of slowdown, but not enough for me to want to turn it down to 720p. Now, for God of War 2, 720p was definitely the sweet spot. This actually gave a pretty stable 60 frames per second across the board. And so for me, that's pretty impressive. 720p of God of War 2 on the PS2 on a PC like this, that's a good sign that most of the games are going to play well. But of course, there are a few white whale games, things like Champions of Norrath. This one just never plays well. I've actually never seen this game running at a full speed at a higher resolution than 480p. Now, at 480p, this one gets pretty close to a stable 60 frames. It will dip down every once in a while, but I would say this is still playable. Although to be fair, at 480p it looks super muddy compared to the others. Okay, let's move up a generation to Wii U. Now for these, we're going to play it at the native 720p resolution of the original console, but as you can see here, it's running just great, 60 frames per second for the most part with Mario Tennis. And same story with Mario Kart. Now you're going to see a little bit of a dip here and there when I'm showing this footage off, but that was because I had the shaders synchronizing in real time. And what that means is as the shaders load, the performance performance is going to get better. But if you turn it to the asynchronous shaders on the Vulkan backend, it'll actually just have everything pop in instead. And so Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is a good example. I had turned the settings on at this point, and so as you can see, it's very stable in the frame rate, but every once in a while a texture will pop in. It's up to you to choose which one you would prefer. I personally like to sync my shaders in real time because I get a little bit of slowdown in the beginning, but afterwards it looks really nice and smooth. Anyway, finally I want to show Breath of the Wild. This is running at a pretty good frame rate. We're looking at about 40 frames per second. And this is easily the most challenging Wii U game that I can test, and if this is running at 40, then I think the rest are going to be good. So what I would do in this scenario is I would lock it at 40 frames per second in the graphics pack, and that way I would have very smooth gameplay for the whole game. Either way, Wii U works surprisingly well on this machine. So let's move over to Nintendo Switch next. As expected, the easier lightweight games, things like Celeste or Child of Light, absolutely no problem here, they're running at a full frame rate. Now, Super Mario 3D World as well as Bowser's Fury did not stay at a stable 60 frames, but it was pretty close most of the time. I think at worst I saw it at around 55 frames per second, totally playable in my book. Even Super Mario Odyssey was actually pretty good. It wasn't anywhere close to 60 frames per second. I would say about 45 is going to be your average. In some of these smaller areas you will get close to 60, but overall it's still relatively playable with minor slowdowns. Now, unfortunately, Link's Awakening did not get anywhere close to that. We're getting about 25 frames per second average. I would not consider this to be playable. But overall, I would say about half of Nintendo Switch games were emulating really well. Now let's move over to PlayStation 3. I had high hopes for this because it has 8 cores and 16 threads, which is what the PS3 emulator really wants. And yeah, some games, for example Demon's Souls, did play at a stable 30 frames per second, no problem. But unfortunately, most of the others did not play very well. Top Spin 4 had graphical anomalies and also averaged about 40 frames per second. Not great gameplay. Same thing with Dead or Alive 5. This one looked really nice, but it was averaging about 30-35 frames per second, making it totally unplayable. And same thing with 3D platformers, things like Heavenly Sword. This one actually only got about 12-15 frames per second. Absolutely unplayable in my book. So unfortunately, I would say unless it's a very lightweight PS3 game that you want to try to emulate, this one's not going to be a great fit. The last system I tested for Windows-based emulation was the original Xbox. In this one I tried at a native resolution, and unfortunately this one wasn't that great. Halo's a great example. There were moments where it was 60 frames per second, but other times it would dip to about 40. And so overall the gameplay experience was just kind of jarring. Other games that usually will boot up just fine, like Dead or Alive 3, actually would freeze on the loading screen. And so overall I just don't think this is going to be a great experience when it comes to original Xbox emulation on this mini PC. Now the ship hasn't sailed yet, we have one more thing to test, and that is Batocera. If you're not familiar with Batocera, this is a Linux distribution that is focused on retro game emulation. And so it's the closest thing you can find to a plug-and-play experience out of the box. This has a bunch of different themes that can really kind of tailor your gameplay experience, and the navigation is just really nice on this as well. And because it's running with Linux drivers, sometimes these will work better than on Windows. Xbox is a great example here. As you can see, Halo is running at basically full speed, but with a double resolution. So effectively, this is running at least twice as good as it was on Windows. And so if you are looking to emulate original Xbox, I would recommend doing it on the Linux side here with Batocera. As you can see, the performance is great. And also keep in mind, I'm upscaling this to a 2x resolution, so it's even going to look better than normal. And so yes, when it comes to Xbox emulation, I would recommend Batocera. Another system that tends to do better on Linux than Windows when it comes to emulation is 3DS through the Citra emulator. And as you can see here, I'm running at a 3x or a 1080p resolution, and Mario Kart 7 is running just fine. I would say this is a bit on the upper end in terms of how hard games are to emulate, but something like Super Mario 3D Land is going to give you a better indication of the performance here. For this, I had to drop it to a 2x resolution, and also you can see with the frame rate, it's not a stable 60. But if you look at the gameplay itself, you can see it's actually still really nice and smooth. In fact, if I didn't see the numbers on the bottom left, I would just think this is fine. The same thing happened with Metroid Samus Returns. And so I think this is one of those cases where, yes, the numbers don't show it as being at 60 frames per second, but still absolutely playable in my book. And so yes, I think 3DS is just fine here on Batocera. But of course, the beauty of Batocera is that you're not just limited to those high-end emulators, you can have just a full emulation system. So you can throw on things like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Dreamcast, whatever floats your boat. And so yeah, I think when it comes to retro gaming, all the way up to Gen 5, no problem here. Let's test a little bit further though with GameCube and PS2 on this as well. In terms of GameCube, absolutely no problems. You can see here F-Zero GX still at 1080p was running at a full frame rate. So I think across the board, you're going to get about the same results results when it comes to Dolphin between Linux and Windows. Now, when it comes to PS2 emulation, it does a pretty good job, but I don't think it's as good as it was on Windows. I would say most of the catalog can still play at 1080p, as you can see here with Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2. But if we compare apples to apples, you can see here God of War 2 running at a 720p resolution, which was stable 60, and Windows is only getting about 50 frames per second here in Linux. And so when it comes to performance, there will be some sacrifices when it comes to PS2 with this over Windows. And so it's going to be up to you to decide which one you would rather use. Now let's try one more system on Batocera here just to confirm that performance isn't quite there as it is on Windows. You can see here with Super Mario 3D World and also with Mario Kart 8, these were playing at 60 frames stable at the native 720p resolution. And so at least with these kind of middle tier Wii U games, yeah, the performance is kind of equitable. But if you try to move it up to Breath of the Wild, as you can see here, it's struggling even to reach 20 frames per second. If you remember on Windows, we were getting an average of about 40 and it was nice and smooth. And so if you are looking to play Breath of the Wild on the Wii U, I would definitely recommend doing it on Windows over Batocera. But you know, the main strength of Batocera is just having everything in one single place. In fact, a nice setup for this would be to use just the regular Windows side of the device for home office tasks. If you wanted to use it for browsing and shopping and taxes and some light video editing, you can do all that on Windows. And what you could do then is you could load up the second M.2 slot with another SSD that could be running Batocera, or you could run it off a flash drive like what I'm doing here. And I have a video guide for that, I'll leave it linked in the video description. Anyway, I think when it comes to the Batocera experience, as you can see here, yes, it is going to give you a better navigation experience and it's just going to give you an all-in-one package. And some systems are going to emulate better than others, Xbox and 3DS in particular. But you will have to make sacrifices with other systems. PS2 and Wii U in particular don't play as well as they do on Windows. Anyway, we've been at this for a while, so let's go ahead and start wrapping up. We'll talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MinisForum TH80. Now, in terms of what I like the design here. I think it is a very nice and kind of sleek interface. It does look very nice sitting on a desk. And as we saw, the non-gaming tasks work well. I think this would be great for browsing and home office applications. And if you wanted to do some video editing all the way up to 1080p, this should work fine. The PC itself was relatively quiet. I could rarely hear it when the fans would kick on, and even then it had a nice pleasant sound. And I think when it comes to emulation, this did perform pretty well, especially on the Windows side. I was surprised to find that Wii U played just fine, and Nintendo Switch actually about half of games were playing really well too. PS3 was a bit of a disappointment, but everything else was great. Now in terms of what I don't like, I think number one here is the PC gaming performance. Now this isn't being marketed as a gaming PC in the first place, but all the same, it would be nice to have a little bit of 1080p gaming for this system. Instead, you're mostly going to be stuck to 720p and the lowest settings you can find. I was also disappointed to find how hard it was to upgrade the device. Just getting access to it required you to pull off a weird adhesive, and the screw holes were actually kind of hard to access too. And even once you do have it opened up, getting to the RAM is not going to be an easy task. And so while it is upgradable, I don't think it is for the faint-hearted. I think it would have been handy to have a dedicated SATA drive slot as well, and I feel like there is room inside the PC for one too. I appreciate that it has an M.2 slot, but all the same, I think a SATA drive is going to be cheaper and easier to find. And finally, this one's kind of weird, but I found it to be a little bit too lightweight, especially compared to the Mac Mini that I have at home. In fact, I found that the PC itself was so lightweight that it would slip and slide a little bit around on the desk when I was plugging things in. I think if they had just added a little bit more weight to the bottom, it would just feel like a much heftier and nicer mini PC. But in the end, I think that's totally a minor gripe. And so at the end of the day, do I recommend buying the MinisForum TH80? Well, I think this one really comes down to context. If you're looking for something in a home office environment, and if you want to do some retro emulation focusing on PS2 and GameCube with some Wii U and Nintendo Switch thrown into the mix, then yeah, this might be a good fit. But in particular, if you're also looking for PC gaming, I don't think this is going to be a good fit. For around $650, you could find other mini PCs from MinisForum and other competitors like B-Link who are going to do just a bit better when it comes to PC gaming. At the very least, you should be able to play some AAA 1080p titles going back at least 10 years. And so in the end, yes, this does have a use case to it, but I don't think it's going to be the target use case of my audience. The emulation is great, but the PC gaming is lacking. But I would say if this model goes on sale sometime in the future and you can find it for under $500, then it might be worth considering. Either way, I hope you liked this video and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.